Hello, today is Tuesday, September 14th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. As we have discussed many times on these podcasts, the race to win the 5G marketplace is fully on between the world's carriers. And nowhere is the fight for dominance more bare-knuckled than right here in the good old USA, with T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T laying out their plans and their money, lots of money, to own a piece of this next-generation wireless market. I recently recorded a podcast with the head of LB3's wireless practice, my buddy Kevin DiLallo, where we discussed the results of the FCC auction for spectrum licenses in the C-band. The auction was critically important because these licenses provide the exclusive rights to use portions of the C-band spectrum that are needed by a carrier to build out their 5G service offerings. Kevin explained how AT&T and Verizon paid some big bucks for C-band licenses to catch up with T-Mobile, who was already sitting on a lot of valuable mid-band spectrum as a result of its acquisition with Sprint. But at the beginning of this month, AT&T filed a petition at the Federal Communications Commission asking for the adoption of so-called spectrum screens in what looks like an effort to limit T-Mobile's advantage in the race for 5G preeminence. So what gives? Well, we're going to find out because today I'm again joined by Kevin DiLallo, and we also have Andrew Brown, the managing partner of LB3 and the chairman of TC2. And we're going to talk about AT&T's latest move, or maybe even their power play, and what it means for enterprise customers. Hey, welcome, gentlemen.
Good to be here, Joe.
Yeah, good to be back.
Okay, so Kevin, let me start with you. You did a great job on that recent podcast explaining the C-band auction. And to me, it seemed like the auction had concluded successfully with the license awards to the bidders. The spectrum had been allocated and everyone can move on building their 5G services. So what's the story behind this AT&T latest move?
Well, Joe, I guess it depends on whom you ask. You laid out the context really well in the introduction in terms of the race for spectrum among these three wireless carriers. Verizon and AT&T definitely went big in the auction to buy real estate in the C-band spectrum, playing catch-up to T-Mobile, and both paid a whole lot of money to expand their holdings, Verizon paying almost $50 billion and AT&T paying almost $30 billion, including auction-related fees. But then, once the auction was over, AT&T turned around and filed a petition for rulemaking with the Federal Communications Commission, asking the commission to adopt a so-called spectrum screen, which would prevent any single carrier licensee from amassing more than a third of the available mid-band spectrum in any geographic market.
And that mid-band spectrum is what the carriers really need to transmit mobile and fixed 5G services.
That's right. And that's why it's so valuable right now. As you mentioned, T-Mobile was sitting on a lot of it after its Sprint acquisition, particularly in the lower end of that range around 2.5 gigahertz. But all the carriers are looking to acquire and use spectrum throughout the C-band, which, as you mentioned, extends all the way up to 6 gig.
So why is AT&T asking the FCC to limit how much spectrum each carrier can get?
Well, again, I suppose it depends on whom you ask. If you're AT&T, you're trying to make the not at all absurd argument that C-band is a critical resource and that the government regulator in the spectrum needs to make sure that there's not too much concentration of that asset with a single provider or providers. T-Mobile CEO actually bragged to Wall Street analysts that T-Mobile had bid up the price of the spectrum that it incidentally didn't really need and thus forced its competitors to, and here's a direct quote, go all in with a break-the-bank attempt to remain relevant in the 5G era, close quote. AT&T seized on these comments in its petition to show that T-Mobile purposely bid up the prices in the auction solely to thwart competition. But if you're more skeptical or cynical of AT&T's motives, which is never hard and rarely wrong, you're probably thinking that AT&T is just trying to have the government step in to limit its competitors from dominating a market where it's already behind and struggling to find the cash that it needs to keep up.
So, Andrew, where are you on this? Is AT&T just a good corporate citizen supporting sensible regulation to preserve competition, or is it cynically exploiting the regulatory process to protect its own position?
Well, it's probably a lot of both. Kevin and I were laughing about this earlier because There's no question that AT&T is shamelessly begging the government to intervene to help it out here and slow down a race where it's actually losing ground to its competitors. It's hard to be at all sympathetic to their situation because it's largely the result of their own doing. They've been pursuing one extraordinarily expensive and failed game-changing strategy after another over the last few years. And now that they've returned home to the network services market, they're all of a sudden reminded how expensive it is to build and run networks. And that's just really hard to do with limited cash.
That reminds me of what you and I discussed on a prior podcast about AT&T's decision to abandon its mega mergers with Time Warner and DirecTV because it needed to shore up its cash position to compete in 5G.
Yeah, that's right. AT&T spent 2 to 3 years pursuing a very different strategy, messing around with becoming a global content provider and movie producer, then walking away from that strategy when the difficulty and execution and expense of it all became very real to them. And yes, AT&T is being totally hypocritical and self-interested here. They are usually the one opposing spectrum screens, and they're usually the one bragging to Wall Street about how they dominate a market while at the same time arguing to government regulators that the same markets are fully competitive and don't need to be regulated. So calling out T-Mobile for that is a bit rich, even if entirely predictable coming from AT&T. But, all that said, what they are asking for is hardly unprecedented. And it even makes sense if you are concerned about preventing too much concentration in the wireless marketplace.
Yeah, the Commission has used spectrum screens in the past to prevent just that kind of overconcentration in the sub 2.5 gigahertz and the higher millimeter wave bands, usually limiting any one licensee to holding about a third of that band. AT&T claims T-Mobile will own 40% of the available mid-band spectrum in many markets. And interestingly, they're urging the Commission not only to adopt the one-third limit for mid-band frequencies, but to require licensees who exceed the cap to divest excess spectrum to willing buyers. No self-interested self-dealing here, I'm sure.
So, Andrew, what does this mean for the enterprise market? Is it going to slow down the offering of 5G services to the enterprise? Or maybe accelerate it? I'm just wondering if there's any impact at all that our clients should care about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'll defer to Kevin, who knows this market as well as anyone, but I will say that I think it's great when these three carriers are clashing in regulatory proceedings and in the marketplace because it shows some competitive spirit. Competition is good for enterprises. It's really the best and only way for companies to get innovative services and good prices in the market. So we definitely want to see the three wireless providers going after business, racing to build out their networks, and investing in future services. We just don't want to see them using the regulatory process to thwart that. So you guys discussed last week that T-Mobile has not been a major player in the enterprise market. So perhaps this demonstrates a willingness on their part to be more serious about that opportunity. And, enterprise customers probably recognize better than anyone AT&T's moves here because that's often the AT&T they deal with in negotiations, right? I mean, they're not that innovative. They're slow to move, very bureaucratic, using process instead of creativity to get things resolved. And they're always focused on what AT&T needs more than what their customers really want. So it definitely has the kind of lingering characteristics of this monopolist trying to throw a little gum in the works so it can get back in the game.
That it does, but AT&T's basic argument is a sound one. Wireless competition is best served by limiting the amount of spectrum any one carrier can control in a given market. And Andrew, as you pointed out, competition is always good for enterprises. The more providers and solutions they have to choose from, the better the performance and pricing generally. As heavily burdened by debt as AT&T is, we shouldn't count it out. It's a fierce competitor with a storied brand. Wireless customers need a strong third provider to truly discipline the market and prevent it from becoming a duopoly, which it practically was before T-Mobile acquired Sprint. Neither T-Mo nor Sprint alone had the customer base to force Verizon Wireless, who itself is a cutthroat competitor, or AT&T to be more responsive to their customers' needs and budgets. The bottom line here is AT&T's petition for rulemaking, while it looks heavy-handed, is probably a good thing, though it'll take a few years before enterprise customers will reap the benefits of having three strong, well-matched players from whom they can select their next-generation 5G services.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you as well, Andrew. Now, there is a lot happening in the wireless world, and, well, gosh, with ICT in general. So if you would like to hear more, Kevin, Andrew, me, or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2, we would be happy to talk to you about it. You can connect by shooting us an email or just give us a call. You can also stay current by subscribing to these podcasts, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.